Somewhere out on the ocean right now, a cruise ship the size of a small town is sailing straight into a storm. And while passengers are told to stay calm, the crew below deck is running a survival routine most people never see. Here's how they actually get through it. Surviving a storm at sea doesn't start when the waves get big. It starts days earlier, in a room most passengers never even know exists. The ship's navigation office. Cruise lines employ dedicated meteorologists and weather routing services that track storm systems constantly, feeding data straight to the bridge. Captains and officers use this data to plot what's called a weather routing course, often changing the ship's path hundreds of miles in advance to avoid the worst of a system entirely. Modern cruise ships are fast enough and the ocean big enough that most storms can simply be steered around. The goal is never to prove the ship can survive a storm head-on. The goal is to never be in one in the first place. But sometimes a storm shifts unexpectedly, speeds up, or the only alternate route would cost days of delay and fuel the ship doesn't have. When that happens, the crew shifts from avoidance mode into survival mode. Weather routing isn't a one-time decision either. It's constantly updated. Officers on the bridge receive fresh forecast data every few hours, sometimes more often as a storm gets closer, and the ship's course gets adjusted in small increments the entire time. A route plotted 3 days out might shift a dozen times before the ship actually reaches that stretch of ocean, as new data comes in about the storm's speed, size, and direction. The first thing that happens once a storm is confirmed unavoidable is a ship-wide securing operation. Every department has a role. In the galley, kitchen staff strap down ovens, lock cabinet doors, and clear countertops of anything that could become a projectile if the ship rolls hard. Loose equipment gets bungee corded to counters or removed entirely. Housekeeping teams move through guest cabins and public areas, securing furniture, closing curtains, and locking away anything breakable in bars, shops, and lounges. Deck crew check that lifeboats, tenders, and outdoor equipment are properly fastened, since storm force winds can turn an unsecured object into a serious hazard. Perhaps most critically, the crew closes the ship's watertight doors, heavy steel doors built into the hull that divide the ship into separate sealed compartments. If water were ever to breach one section, these doors are designed to keep it contained rather than letting it flood the entire vessel. Testing and closing these doors is one of the first things that happens once heavy weather is confirmed. This entire process, from the first announcement to a fully secured ship, typically takes a few hours and follows a checklist drilled into every department head. Housekeeping supervisors walk deck by deck confirming every cabin has been checked. Galley managers sign off that every kitchen station is locked down. Nothing gets marked complete until it's been physically verified. Because once the ship starts rolling in earnest, there's no safe time to go back and fix something that was missed. Outdoor crew have arguably the hardest version of this job. Deckhands may need to work in high winds and rain to secure equipment on open decks before conditions get too dangerous to be outside at all. A race against the clock that has to finish well before the storm's worst winds actually arrive. Once outdoor areas are locked down and access doors sealed, no one is permitted back outside until the ship's officers confirm conditions have improved enough to make it safe again. On the bridge, the officer of the watch and captain work in shifts, constantly adjusting speed and heading to minimize how hard the ship rolls and pitches. Taking waves directly on the side of the ship, known as beam seas, creates the most violent rolling motion. So officers will often angle the bow slightly into the waves instead, even if it means a longer, slower route through the worst of the weather. Modern cruise ships also rely on stabilizer fins, large underwater wings that extend from the hull and constantly adjust their angle to counteract rolling. The same basic principle as an airplane wing generating lift, just sideways. In heavy seas, these fins are working overtime, and bridge officers monitor them closely to make sure they're performing as expected. Speed gets reduced too. Slowing the ship down doesn't just reduce stress on the hull. It also gives officers more reaction time to adjust course around the worst individual wave sets, which can vary significantly even within the same storm system. Communication becomes constant during this period. The bridge stays in contact with the engine room, monitoring how the ship's propulsion and stabilizer systems are handling the conditions, while also relaying updates to guest services so announcements to passengers stay accurate and consistent. A ship's captain will often personally record these announcements during a serious storm, since passengers tend to find a calm, direct message from the captain far more reassuring than one delivered through the regular PA system by other staff. While all of this is happening, most crew members are still expected to work their regular shifts. Storms don't cancel meal service, cleaning schedules, or guest support. That means crew are moving through pitching hallways, carrying trays, mopping floors that are actively tilting, and trying to stay upright while doing physically demanding jobs. Experienced crew develop what's often called sea legs, an intuitive, almost automatic ability to adjust balance to the ship's motion without consciously thinking about it. New crew members, especially on their first storm, often struggle far more, both physically and with seasickness, even in cabins located deep in the hull where motion is usually less noticeable. Crew cabins themselves get braced too. Loose items go into drawers, anything breakable gets wedged with towels or clothing, and many crew describe wedging themselves into their bunk with pillows on either side just to avoid being thrown out of bed during a hard roll. New hires often go through their first real storm within the first few weeks of a contract, and it tends to become a kind of unofficial rite of passage. Veteran crew will often check in on newer colleagues, walk them through simple tricks, bending the knees instead of locking them, always keeping one hand free for a railing, eating small amounts regularly rather than skipping meals when queasy. The same practical wisdom passed down for as long as ships have sailed through weather. Shift patterns often change too. Department heads may pair experienced crew with newer staff on the same shift during a storm, partly for safety, and partly so someone who's been through it before can talk a nervous colleague through a hard roll in real time. Break rooms in crew mess areas tend to fill up faster than usual during a storm, not because crew are avoiding work, but because those spaces near the ship's center offer the steadiest footing on the entire vessel, and a few minutes there between tasks makes the rest of the shift noticeably easier to manage. None of this happens by instinct alone. Every crew member, regardless of department, completes mandatory safety training before ever setting foot on a working shift, covering everything from muster station procedures to how to move safely through the ship in rough conditions. Officers go further, training in bridge simulators that can recreate extreme sea states without ever leaving a training center on land. These simulators let officers practice decisions they'll hopefully never need in real life. How to respond if stabilizers fail mid-storm, how to reroute if a scheduled port becomes unsafe to approach, how to coordinate with other vessels in Coast Guard services if conditions deteriorate faster than forecast. Crew are also required to participate in regular onboard drills throughout a contract, not just during onboarding, specifically so the response to sudden heavy weather becomes close to automatic rather than something anyone has to think through from scratch in the moment. These drills aren't limited to officers either. Crew across every department run scheduled emergency exercises, muster drills, fire drills, and heavy weather procedure walkthroughs, often on a weekly rotation throughout a contract. Regulatory bodies require documented proof that this training happens consistently, and inspectors can and do review those records during routine ship inspections. The repetition is deliberate. By the time an actual storm hits, most crew have already run through the exact sequence of actions so many times that there's very little left to figure out in the moment. Managing passengers during a storm is its own operation entirely. Outdoor decks get closed off. Pool areas are drained or covered. Activities that involve movement, dance classes, sports courts, anything near railings, get canceled or moved indoors. Elevators are sometimes shut off entirely during the worst of the rolling, both for safety and because erratic ship movement can interfere with how they operate. Crew are trained to project calm regardless of how they personally feel about the conditions. Guest-facing staff are specifically coached on tone, reassuring, matter of fact, never alarmed, because passenger anxiety tends to mirror crew behavior almost exactly. A nervous announcement from the bridge can spread panic through a ship faster than the storm itself. Behind the scenes, medical teams prepare for an increase in seasickness cases and minor injuries from falls, restocking motion sickness medication and bracing for a busier than usual night in the ship's infirmary. Guest services and entertainment teams also shift into a different mode entirely. Scheduled shows and activities often get replaced with something calmer. Movies in the theater, quiet lounge music, card games in indoor spaces. partly to keep passengers occupied and distracted, and partly to reduce the number of people moving around the ship unnecessarily while it's rolling. Some ships even open up extra lounge space near the ship's center, which experiences the least motion, so anxious passengers have somewhere more stable to sit it out. Modern cruise ships are engineered specifically for this. Their hulls are designed with a low center of gravity, wide beams for stability, and structural redundancy that lets them absorb far more punishment than most passengers ever realize while watching waves crash against their balcony window. Storms that look terrifying from a cabin window are, in most cases, well within the operational limits the ship was built and tested for. That said, crew training accounts for the rare situations where things do go wrong. Officers drill regularly for scenarios involving mechanical failure during heavy weather, loss of stabilizers, or the need to divert to the nearest safe port. Every crew member, regardless of department, goes through mandatory safety training that covers what to do if conditions escalate beyond a standard storm passage, evacuation procedures, muster stations, and emergency communication protocols that get refreshed multiple times throughout a single contract. There have been rare, well-documented cases of ships encountering storms severe enough to cause real damage. Broken windows, flooded lower decks, injured passengers and crew. These incidents get studied closely across the entire industry, often leading directly to updated procedures, stronger structural standards, or changes in weather routing policy that affect every ship built afterward. Insurance assessments, engineering reviews, and internal investigations follow any serious storm incident, and the findings rarely stay isolated to one cruise line. Because the entire industry shares classification societies, safety regulators, and often the same shipbuilders, a lesson learned on one ship tends to filter into design standards across the board within a few years, which is part of why storm-related structural failures have become significantly rarer as fleets have modernized. For the vast majority of crew, though, surviving a storm isn't really about surviving at all. It's a routine they've drilled dozens of times, on a ship built with exactly this scenario in mind, working alongside people who've done it just as many times as they have, even if, from the passenger decks above, it looks like complete chaos.